Welcome to the Gaudium et Spes podcast. Every other week, we bring you Catholic teachings and stories of faith from people throughout the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. This is the Gaudium et Spes podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Gaudium et Spes podcast. I hope you all had a great Christmas break and a holiday season as we get back into the swing of things in 2023. As you can see or hear, I'm by myself. Poor Suzanne was not able to make her schedule work to be with us this week, so I'm going it alone, so forgive us for that. I'm going to start off as usual before we get into the episode with our usual line from Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 1, which goes, "The joys and the hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and the hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ." And probably for maybe every single one of you listening to this podcast, the main grief or piece of news that happened and since our last podcast was the passing of Pope Benedict XVI. And what a joy it was to have him in our lives for the 95 years that he was with us, and sad to say goodbye to him. And there's been a million, maybe tens of millions of tributes around the world to him and just what he meant to people personally and theologically and as a leader in the church. And I subscribe to most of those, to all of those, basically. He's the author that I have in my bookshelf the most, and just an amazing former in the faith. But I was reflecting on kind of like how do you experience something like this? And one of the beautiful things about Pope Benedict is he's always been kind of a personal grace of God. He was born in 1927 in southern Bavaria. And my mom's mom, my maternal grandmother, the one grandparent who I knew while I was a child and into teenage and adult years because the other grandparents had passed away. My mom's mom was from the same part of Bavaria called Bad Aibling. And actually when Pope Benedict was a young man, he moved to a town just about 30 miles away from where my grandmother was. So when I heard his voice, I heard my grandmother, my Oma's voice. It was always kind of a beautiful, comforting thing. And like so many people in that part of the world, and you might have read about Pope Benedict's his early biography, his life was upended by the advent of Nazism and the Second World War, and he was drafted into military service. And I know after the death of John Paul II and the election of Pope Benedict, a lot of people were like, "Oh my gosh, our Pope served in the German army in World War II." It was kind of a shock to most of them. And I often wonder about my grandmother's life, who was just a year older than Pope Benedict at that time, the things that happened to her family and the sufferings they endured. And anyhow, it drove home his early life, this kind of anonymous man who was just part of millions of people in this conflict, who knew at that point in time that he was marked out for the life of service to the church and to the world that he was. He was just another guy in a gray uniform, a 17-year-old boy, who was swept up in this great conflict. And it made me think of a couple of parables from the Lord. Number one, when Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem in the Gospel of Luke, and he is not welcomed in a town in Samaria, and his apostle friends, John and James, are like, "Hey, Lord, should we call down fire to consume these people?" And the Lord rebukes him, and he's like, that's a bad idea. And another one where Jesus tells the parable of the wheat and the weeds. So basically a farmer sows good seeds and grows good wheat, but he wakes to find that there's a bunch of weeds, and the Lord tells us that this was done by an enemy. But don't rip up everything. You have to wait till the end of let the weeds and the wheat grow up together. And I think sometimes our constant tendency as human beings is to kind of look at our enemies or our other folks who are not in our particular camp or whatever ideological mindset we find ourselves in. We're like, bad, us good. And I can't help but think that probably for many, Joseph Ratzinger at that point in time was in that camp of like, he's in a bad uniform and should not, do away with these people or whatever. But we don't know the Lord's plans for people at various points in lives. We don't know the stages of conversion and the stages of life that will take place. And so there's always a beautiful patience in front of every individual human being that the Christian is called to have. And I think Pope Benedict's life, who would have thought a man who grew up in that era, in that time, in that place, under that regime, was destined to become one of the most beloved churchmen and popes of the modern era, or maybe ever. So we pray for his soul, and we thank God for his life. And anyhow, Speaking of churchmen and leaders, it's time for a wonderful episode to kick off the new year with a special guest, not just Bishop Bill, who we're, of course, used to on this podcast, but our neighbor to the west, Archbishop Rodi, came in and just talked with our bishop about the history of our diocese. So it's an amazing conversation to learn about the joint history of our two dioceses together, the history of the Panhandle, and God's plans and work in this part of the world. So I'll see you on the other side.
So it's so good to be here. You know, a lot of times we have on this podcast, I'll give a teaching about the Bible or the catechism or something like that, or share something about my life or the life of a bishop. And then we also have people normally from within our diocese, just talk about what they do and everything. But today it's exciting because I have a brother bishop here, Archbishop Thomas Rodi from the Archdiocese of Mobile. So it's kind of fun to be able to share this with you and everything. And but first of all, people ask me a lot of questions, who's your boss? It's the Archbishop probably. And then who's his boss? It's a cardinal. Who's his boss? It's the Pope. And I'd say, well, it doesn't really work that way. But that is a question that people will ask when they see us. They'll see, okay, you're just a bishop. He's an archbishop. What is an archbishop? Do you mind introducing yourself and maybe answering that?
Well, first of all, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks. And to be in our neighboring diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. Truly a pleasure. An archbishop has no authority over the bishops of his area. He is first among equals. An archbishop is one who is to have the other bishops of the area come together to discuss common concerns and common issues, just to stay in communion with each other. So in any area of diocese, one diocese, for whatever reason, the oldest, the largest, whatever it may be, is designated as the archdiocese, and its bishop is referred to as the archbishop. And he's just there to have communion within that area. So for Florida, the archbishop is the Archbishop of Miami. And for Alabama, Mississippi, it's Mobile.
Great. And it's just interesting, the bishop is called the ordinary of the diocese, but the archbishop of that province is the metropolitan. So it's kind of a fun word. You are a metropolitan.
Yeah.
Isn't that great? Well, good.
Yeah, whatever that, no more authority, just some more responsibility maybe.
That's great.
But every bishop is the bishop, the shepherd for his diocese.
Absolutely.
Whether he's a bishop or an archbishop.
Good. And you talked about how we are neighboring dioceses, archdiocese and diocese. And that really is neat. It's maybe people don't know that or they don't think about that, but it's nice, how should I say? I've shared before on this podcast how, it can be a very challenging vocation for us as bishops. I'll even share lonely, or lonely may not be the thing, but we're often alone in our decision making, and it's just nice to know that we are not alone. We are brothers together, and we celebrate that, or we come together for the big gatherings and maybe regional gatherings. But just knowing that you're there, we haven't really connected very much locally here, but just knowing that you're right there, a couple of miles away, your archdiocese starts. But it's also good for people to know that we have a common history. Part of our diocese came from the Archdiocese of Mobile. And you know more about that than I do. I really need to know this. People ask me all the time, and I say, I'll look into that. I'll give you an answer later. But
the history of the Catholic Church, both in Pensacola and in Mobile, is a long history. We have rich heritage. But as far as having a bishop, the first bishop for Mobile was in 1825, and his diocese, the Diocese of Mobile, encompassed everything that today is Alabama and Florida.
Amazing.
So he had everything from the northern part of Alabama to Key West. Wow. A lot of territory. And when he arrived in Mobile, he found he had 3 churches, one in Mobile, one in Pensacola, and one in St. Augustine. And there was one priest in Florida. And when he heard the great news that a bishop had arrived, he left. And so there was no priest in the whole diocese.
Wow.
That's what the Vatican would do when those early frontier bishops, they would consecrate him a bishop and say, go see what you can start. Wow. And so Bishop Portier, the first bishop of Mobile and the Floridas, as it was referred to, he was 30 years old when he became bishop.
Wow.
And we have his description, for example, of riding his horse from Mobile to St. Augustine to celebrate Mass for his parishioners in St. Augustine. Took him 3 weeks to get from Mobile to St. Augustine. If he could find a cabin and he was welcomed, he'd spend the night there. Otherwise, he said he would stay outside with the snakes, the mosquitoes, and the alligators.
Wow.
So there is that history that we started together as the bishop, as the Diocese of Mobile, and the Florida Panhandle continued to be part of the Diocese of Mobile until 1968. Mm-hmm. And so we have a long history from 1825 to 1968. Mobile and Pensacola were in the same diocese.
It's amazing. And I'm sure you drive around a lot in your archdiocese. I know I do, back and forth to Tallahassee and even further to Madison, Monticello, and down to Perry, and just and Panama City, Apalachicola. I just drive constantly back and forth. But that's in a car. It's 3 hours to get to Tallahassee, maybe 3 hours, 15 minutes to get to the furthest point, but not 3 weeks on horseback. I can't imagine that.
Those frontier bishops had to have been amazing guys.
Yeah, sleep outside and all that. So I won't complain anymore about being on I-10.
And yet he built up churches in Alabama and in Florida, schools, a rich history.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
So our roots have a lot of commonality in our two dioceses.
And then for us, just to continue that in 1968, if I'm right, because again, I get confused all the time, but then we were still part of the Archdiocese of Mobile until 68, and then it was sectioned off. We were
then
this
Pensacola
part of the
became part of St. Augustine.
That's right, yeah.
In preparation for the creation of a new diocese of Pensacola,
1975.
Tallahassee.
Right. Then it was carved out of that. Then we became our own diocese then. So we're getting ready to celebrate our 50th anniversary. But Mobile,
that's
they're
special.
200th. No, I don't know what it is coming up. But anyway, it's really exciting. That's neat. So that's great to be able to celebrate that. Now, you told me something, we were talking about this before, about your predecessor having 5 challenges or 5 areas of focus for him. And I like that.
First bishop, Bishop Portier, I love learning about his history. And I love history in general because things really don't change that much. And by learning our history, we can learn how we handle today, or at least we can be encouraged to know that previous generations handled similar challenges and the church went on. It's not our work, it's the work of Jesus Christ. And we're just instruments. But look at Bishop Portier, 1825, and being bishop until 1859. That was a number of years. These were, in no particular order, these were his challenges that he found. First, catechizing, spreading the good news of Jesus Christ in a society that really didn't support it. We have perhaps romanticize the early history of our area. Those were the good old days. No, those people who were coming to Florida or Alabama in the 1800s, they were just trying to survive. They were living in houses made out of trees, log cabins. They weren't yet at the point of building churches or schools. And so there was no religious education for children. There was no adult religious education programs. How do you spread the good news in such a primitive time? Priests could only be there once a year or whatever. So it wasn't a society that supported teaching the faith. So how to catechize in that situation? How to take care of the poor? There was so many different pandemics at the time, yellow fever and other illnesses, and children were left orphaned because their parents died, or the breadwinner of the home would die, and the family was left destitute. How to take care of the poor. Vocations. As I said, he didn't have one priest. Wow. And so he would plead with seminarians and young priests in France, where he was from originally, to please come and serve on the American frontier. Immigrants. The priests that all came spoke French. Immigrants were coming who spoke a different language. They spoke English. They were from Ireland. And how to minister to these immigrants who spoke a different language than the priest. All right? How to pay for all this. He was constantly trying to raise money to build schools and churches and orphanages. And he dealt with the scandalous behavior of one of the priests. Now, those 6 things I just mentioned, if you want to know what my challenges are today, it's the same 6.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, it's, people, like you said, I like what you said, people say, oh, the good old days or something, or they imagine that this is unprecedented. This is the worst the world has ever been. How many times have you heard that, And yet, if you look at history, even, ancient history, but just a couple hundred years ago in this area, the same things were the case. In fact, it was worse then. We say, gosh, we need priests, we need more seminarians, and we absolutely do. But to start with 0 or 1 priest, that's amazing. And of course, finances and immigration and all that. So I think, yeah, as you enumerate those challenges, same things here, of course. And I think I was trying to think, because it's always good to think, are there any other challenges? I think in addition to those, one other thing is just how do you unify a church that is so spread out, especially here across the Panhandle? How do you, and that's not a question for you. I mean, it's a question you're dealing with as well in your archdiocese. But for me, that's the case. How do we are one local church, but it looks, I don't want to say looks differently, but maybe feels differently, in Tallahassee or Apalachicola or along the beaches, for us, or up in the rural counties and areas. How do you bring that together? That's a big challenge for me. I'm sure you have that and maybe other challenges.
And I suspect
as well.
Bishop Portier had that too.
Yeah.
In his far-flung locales, that little pockets of Catholic presence, and how make them all feel they're part of the family of the diocese.
Right.
It had to be a struggle for him. So it's a challenge. These challenges we're facing today, that the comfort, the encouragement that comes from knowing that about the past is that the church survived.
Mm-hmm.
The church went on. Not only survived, the church has thrived as the church continues to grow in Pensacola-Tallahassee and in Mobile. The church is growing. And so we've faced challenges before. We can face these. And with God's help, we will do just fine.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that attitude. And I think that's the reason we look at history, to see that, they had those problems. And not only did they survive, they grew, and we can as well. I like that. Good. Well, I think it'd also be good to, a lot of people who listen to this podcast have heard my story ad nauseum probably. And I'm happy to share that again. But if you don't mind, could you share your story? You were born at a young age, I'm guessing.
I was.
All right.
I was. But at least that's what my parents have told me.
But I think Steve Martin used to say that. I was born at a very young age. But just maybe how you became a priest and then a bishop, if you don't mind.
I'll try and make it as brief as possible. But I'm a native of Louisiana. My family has lived on the northern Gulf Coast for a long time, many generations. I was not thinking about being a priest. After college, I went to Georgetown University in D.C., and then I went to law school at Tulane. I wasn't thinking about entering the seminary. But at the end of law school, past the bar, I'm ready to start practicing. I just felt something was missing. And for whatever reason, I cannot point to a moment, a person, an event, I started thinking about being a priest. And as much as I said, no, that's not for me, I couldn't shake it. And so I knew I had to give it a try. And so I told the Lord, I said, I'll give you 1 year in the seminary. I'll stay there a year. I'll make myself stay. Well, the rest is history. And I decided, no, this is something I want to do and what God wants me to do. I tell that story sometime to seniors in high school and to college students, because why did I decide to go to law school? I'm not really sure. I drifted into it. And I'll tell young people about that. I said, always ask yourselves, what do I really want to do with my life? You have one life. What's going to feed your heart? What you're really going to want to do? And ask also, what does God want me to do? But they said, well, everyone asks themselves what they want to do with their life. I said, no, they don't. Mm-hmm. There are counselors who their whole living is dealing with 30 and 40-something-year-olds who drifted into something and are not happy with what they're doing and are looking for a change of career. And I say to college students, people who have graduated from college, they have a few job offers. Which one do they accept? And they laugh, the one that pays the most. I said, yeah. And now they're off on that journey, on that direction. But they didn't ask, what do I really want to do? And for me, with law school, I don't know how I ended up in law school. I suspect it was something like this. Someone said to me, what are you going to do after college? I said, I don't know. Some of my friends are going to law school. And they said, oh, that'd be great. You ought to go to law school. All right. So the next time someone asked me, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm thinking about law school. Oh, that's great. You ought to go to law school. When the next person asked me, I probably said, oh, I'm going to law school. That's great. I drifted into it. I really didn't make that decision. And it was only after law school when I was proud I'd achieved my goal, but there was something missing. And that's when, thank God, at 25, I asked myself, instead of 35 or 45, what do I really want to do with my life? And I caution people about really make that decision. I've talked to married couples who will tell me we drifted into being married. I was a judge on the Metropolitan Tribunal, the marriage court for the church. I heard that from so many people who got divorced. We never really decided. His roommate was getting married. My roommate was getting married. And everyone said, oh, y'all make a nice couple. You ought to think about getting married. Oh, y'all been dating for a couple of years. You ought to think about getting married. So all of a sudden, we're planning the wedding, but we never decided. It's amazing how we human beings sometimes drift into all sorts of decisions without really saying, wait, God, guide me in, is this really what I want to do?
Yeah, that's very interesting. When I was told, when I was discerning, and then later I was a vocation director, you probably did something like that. I'm sure you were involved in that, or you encourage young men, and you certainly work with your seminarians now. I was told that in order to guard against that, just listening to what other people think or what you think, there are 3 questions you should ask. And when you say that, people love formulas, like 3 questions when you're discerning. One is what you've mentioned. What are my friends or my confidants, people who know me well, what do they think I should do? And that is important, but it's not the only one. Another one is, what am I good at? I mean, that's an important part of discernment as you try to think about what are my gifts and my talents, where are they leading me? And the last one is, you mentioned it, what do I want to do? And people think, well, maybe that should be last and not so important. But God wants our happiness. God doesn't want just, us to do something that'll make us miserable. I know we need priests. I really don't want to do it, but my mom says I should do it and other people, so I'm going to do it. I don't want that kind of priest. I don't want someone to just kind of be just go do it because other people say. So it's kind of a safeguard against just listening to what other people think. That's important, but it's also what are my gifts and what do I want to do with my
Our
life.
scripture says God has plans for us, and they're for our good.
Right.
To trust that, just to trust it. That very often when I'll say young people, ask God to guide you, and don't think he's going to say, oh, you have to be a priest, you have to be a nun. No, that's not what he's calling everyone to do.
Yeah.
But he has plans for you, and therefore you're good. He always wants what's for our good. Trust him.
Absolutely. Right. And so you, I didn't know that about you. That's really neat that you are a smart person. You went to law school and Georgetown and everything. Wow. That's fantastic. You could have made a lot more money as a lawyer. I hope you know.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Gosh, I wish you had told me this earlier. Come on, man.
That's great. I went in after high school, actually, as a freshman in high school. I went to. I had grown up right next to Notre Dame. There, my grandfather was graduated 99 years ago now this year from there, and then taught for 40 years. And so just set up our family basically there near campus. And so I just went there. I was helping out a lot as an altar server, and there are 10 of us in my family. So we always helped out at the parish, the school with the sisters, whatever they needed, we were always there raking leaves or whatever. So it was kind of a natural thing. I just thought, you know what? I love being around church. I love serving. I think I'm going to take another step. And I was encouraged to do that. Plus it wasn't so threatening to go to the college seminary there at Notre Dame. It was more like a focused small dormitory, focused on formation and everything. We were regular students, but we were also praying the hours every day in mass and everything. We had spiritual direction and all of that. But and then each year, I felt that, like that sense of affirmation. Yes, I don't know yet. I'm only a sophomore now, but I'm going to keep going. And now I'm a junior. Now I'm a senior. I'll go to the novitiate and we'll see what happens. And that's how God moved me along, I think. It was just a series of small steps. I've said that a lot before, and you said what you say to high school students and college students. What I say especially is, don't get so scared thinking that all of a sudden you're going to have to be a priest tomorrow. No, are you being called to do a 1 year in the seminary? Give it a semester and see what you think. And if you like it, great. Take another step and another step. And 8 years later, then, that'll be another small step then to become a priest. If you're already a deacon, now you feel that this is God saying yes, take that step. So for me, that's what it was. But the bishop, the vocation to be a bishop, or the calling to be a bishop, I wish I could say that was a small step. I'm sure for you that it was the case. For me, that call came out of nowhere, and I've told that story. And it was actually on a Saturday between the 8th grade graduation mass and a wedding, and then confessions. And just in the middle of that, I got this call, and it made no sense.
You were in Texas at the time?
Correct. I was in a parish in Austin, Texas, at St. Ignatius. And it's funny because I just want to hear that from you, if I could, just quickly, how that came to you. And I'm sure this is probably going to be the case for you. People said, "Oh my gosh, Father Rodi, that makes total sense." Yes, but with me, nobody said, "Oh wow, Bill Wack, Bishop." Yeah, absolutely. Even my mom said, "Wait, you, Bill?" I mean, it was fantastic. So, there's a funny story. The day after the press conference, I had quoted Archbishop Amond, because he was the bishop when I was new pastor in Austin, and he gave me my papers, the faculties. And on the back of the paper, he said, on the back of the faculties, he said, "Don't make any changes for the first 10 months. And so when I got here, my press conference was here, the first question from the media was, "What is your vision for the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee?" I said, "Vision? This is my first time in the Panhandle. I have no vision yet. And besides," and I quoted that. So, and then Archbishop Amon called me after that, and he said, "Thanks, Bill. That was neat. I watched it. Thanks for quoting me." And I said, "Yeah, Bishop, why me? What do you think?" And he said, "Yeah, look at you, Bill. I mean, you're not an intellectual." And then he paused a long time. I said, "Hello, I'm still here." He said, "No, hear me out." But he said, "But you're a pastor, and you've worked with the poor, the homeless, and in prisons and jails, and you speak Spanish, and you're from a large family, and that seems to be what Pope Francis is looking for, and that's what we need right now." So that's my quick story. But how about for you? And
people forget really that a bishop is a pastor. Mm-hmm. And a bishop should have the same heart of service as a pastor, because a diocese, for all its administration, all its size, is really just a parish writ large. It really is. But you're asking for me, I was a priest in the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and the nuncio, who in every country, the Pope has an official representative. You could call him the ambassador, whatever. His title is nuncio. Anyhow, the nuncio was visiting New Orleans, and he stayed at the Archbishop's house overnight. I was living there with the Archbishop at the time as the Vicar General. And then he said, "Oh, I want to talk with you." And so I know he wants to know about his transportation back to the airport or whatever. I got this. So, right, what is it that you like? He said, "Oh, the Holy Father has appointed you Bishop of Biloxi." And what I said at that point, I'm sure was eloquent. I have no idea what I said. I didn't even know my name at that point. And the nuncio later said, "Oh, that was a special pleasure." He said, "I always do this by phone. Right. This time I was able to see the reaction. I felt like saying, yes, you enjoyed watching me squirm. Right. But that's how I found out I was going to become Bishop of Biloxi.
Great. And how long did you serve there in Biloxi?
8 years.
Okay.
And then I got a phone call one day from the next nuncio at that time. And we had just, a couple of years before, had a devastating hurricane that just did incredible, catastrophic damage. A third of our churches were gone, a third of our schools, a third of our rectories. A third of our priests lost everything they owned. Wow. Over 200 people had been killed. So many people were homeless. So many. There was just devastation. Yeah. And we were finally at the point of beginning to rebuild this. I'll just give you one little inkling of how devastating it was. The day after the storm, I was trying to get to as many parishes as possible, and I saw a priest from another part of the diocese I hadn't made it to yet. And I asked him, "What about St. Joseph's Church in that area?" He said, "Oh, Bishop," he said, it's gone, but I couldn't find where it used to be. The devastation was so incredible. People couldn't find where their houses used to be. It was that type of immensity of destruction. Anyhow, we were finally at the point that we were rebuilding when I got the phone call, and the nuncio said, "The Holy Father has appointed you Archbishop of Mobile." And I told him, my answer to the church will always be yes, but I would hope this could be reconsidered. Because it's not because of me. Whoever is the bishop of this diocese right now needs to be here, because it's going to take about a year before the next bishop would be appointed. And this diocese should not go for a year without a bishop. Not at this point, not with all that we've been through.
Right.
And he said to me, yes, which I found out later in church means no. He says, yes, God will bless you. And so I made a long conversation short just there. And so, okay, I'm going to Mobile. He called me back about a half hour later, which always impressed me about the nuncio, because he's a very important man, a very busy man. He could have said, okay, that's gone. What's the next thing on my desk? He called me back. He had thought about it, obviously. He said, "You don't think you should move?" I said, "No, I don't." He said, you think that the bishop must stay there?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Good. You'll be bishop of both dioceses." Oh. Good. Now, that is not what I was asking for. So for a year, I was Bishop of Biloxi and Mobile until the new bishop was appointed. Those are my stories of how I got to be Bishop of Biloxi and Archbishop of Mobile.
That's fantastic. My gosh. Well, thank you. I was really especially touched by what you said. You said, my answer will always be yes. Maybe not right now, but yes. And I think that's just really important. People ask me that too. They say, "Well, what did you say when he asked you?" First of all, I think he pressured me. He said, "I need an answer. What shall I tell Pope Francis?" As though the Pope were right there, behind him. What's he saying? He was not there. But anyway, but of course, you and I, we were ordained to serve the church. And so, I didn't really have to think about it. It was just more like the logistics and everything. But yes, of course. But I
did not become a priest to say no to the church.
Nice.
And I remember when I was first ordained a priest, I was at a wedding. I don't know who there was several priests there at this wedding. I don't know who this other priest was. I don't remember who it was. But he said, "Oh, you're newly ordained." I said, "Yes." He said, "Let me give you some advice. Whatever assignment you are offered, say yes. Even if you don't want to go, say yes. You will always find that it will be grace-filled." And I've always remembered that. And there have been assignments that I have been given that I really did not want to, as a priest, to go to this parish or that parish. I have never regretted saying yes.
In this diocese, there's a priest who's kind of like a guru, somebody who is a spiritual director and just a mentor for a lot of men. And I really like what he has passed on to them and to really now the whole presbyterate, all the priests. Basically, is part of what you said is don't ever ask for an assignment and don't ever turn one down when it's given to you. And I thought, wow, that's just a great way to live your life. You don't seek something out, nor do you say no when it comes. Now that may not translate, for people in business or married couples, but for us who take a vow of obedience to the bishop, or to the church, then I think that's great advice. Good. Well, we only have a couple more minutes, and I think it's good because we're brothers together. People have a lot of questions about what we do when we get together at say, for the USCCB, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops in Washington or elsewhere, or regional meetings and everything. I just tell people, we get together and we just have a good time. No, it's a lot of...
I need to go to that meeting.
Not so much.
I missed that part. What really strikes me, though, is how unified we bishops are. That's not how we're necessarily portrayed by some people.
Right.
We're portrayed sometimes as being so divided. We're not. I mean, just because there are differences of opinion doesn't mean there's division. And we know we share so much more than divides us. And the fraternity of bishops is a real thing. And I hope people watching the two of us just talking to each other here might have an inkling into that. We really are united as successors of the apostles in serving the church.
Absolutely. And it also helps, speaking of history, to know that in every council, every gathering of bishops or the apostles, when they came together, Peter and Paul and James and Barnabas, they came together and they disagreed bitterly about how to treat the Gentiles. Should they become Jews in a sense first and then Christians? And they disagreed. And, I said, I will go and point out to his face that he is wrong. And yet they came together, they expressed their ideas and their thoughts about this, and they prayed. And I love it. And then Peter, as the spokesman, of course, for the first pope, said, it is the decision of the Holy Spirit and of us not to impose any burden upon the Gentiles. I love that. And that's been going on. So again, when people say, I watch you on TV, you get up and the media loves to say that, they must be in there just really, they must be bitterly arguing. We debate. We're passionate about where we are. But in the end, it is the decision of the Holy Spirit and of us that blank, should happen.
Absolutely. And it's interesting what you say about Peter and Paul. Paul would disagree to Peter, as he wrote, to his face, yet he always called him Cephas. Paul always called Peter Cephas, rock. That would have been the word Jesus would have used in Aramaic. We are united. You are the rock. I disagree with you, but you are the rock. You are Peter, and we're united.
Oh, that's great.
And I think that's still the attitude among bishops, at least bishops in our country. I can't speak for elsewhere in the world, but I suspect it's very similar. We have a great fraternity as we struggle to do the will of God, discern that with the grace of the Holy Spirit.
Yep. And not only do we have those big meetings, of course, but I like to tell people we get together regionally and is that right? Provincially,
Yes.
And just about a month ago here in Pensacola, I hosted all of the bishops from this province, from Miami. So they all came up, Miami, Palm Beach, Venice, St. Augustine, Orlando, and I'm missing someone, St. Petersburg. They all came up here, and we just had a couple of days together. Yes, we talked about some things, the next legislative session in the spring and kind of what our priorities are. But also we just enjoyed some meals together and some socials in the evening. And it was just really important for us to get together. I like that we do that in smaller regional gatherings as well.
Because we do have the great ability to share in each other's stories that, yes, I'm facing the same things.
Yeah. And
to support each other in trying to serve the Lord and God's people.
Absolutely. That's why it's so great to be with you here today. So thank you.
I appreciate the invitation to join you.
Yeah.
It really is an honor and a privilege.
Yeah, I'd love to come to the Archdiocese. And
we will
do this now.
We will make sure that happens.
Because and also we have a lot of our. Whenever, this is also interesting, people should know this here in our diocese, when we have a question about the history of a parish here, how it was founded, why was it named Immaculate Conception or St. Mary or something like that. It's in your archives, of course. And so I will call your archives, and they're really good, very good to us, and they'll help us to find those answers.
Great.
So it's really neat. Yeah, good. Well, thank you. God bless you.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. And thank you all for joining us today. And may God bless you in this new year as we look ahead, asking God to give us the gifts we need to go forward and to continue to build up the faith in our local churches and in the world, in the country, and especially in your families. God bless you.
Well, as I mentioned, what a cool opportunity to see two bishops, two brothers in the episcopate sit together and discuss the beauty that is the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee and also the Archdiocese of Mobile. It was awesome to be in the room when the bishops were recording this, just to see their friendship and camaraderie develop during their time together. But especially their joint love for our section of the world, our bishop by default by being the bishop here, but also Archbishop Rodi having the shared sense of our whole Gulf Coast Catholic culture, stretching all the way from the Texas area all the way here in the Florida Panhandle and even southwards to Tampa and Venice and those areas. A cool shared history. Some of the things that stood out to me in this episode, just the sheer length of time. I had read this before, but the time that we were joint together between the Archdiocese of Mobile and us here in the Panhandle, 1825 to 1968. That's a quite a shared history. But as you heard, just the sheer difficulties of making Catholicism work in this part of the world that, as the two bishops talked about, we might always think we live in the hardest times or the worst times or something like that. Maybe not the hardest times. Sometimes we think, oh, things have never been worse. And then you hear these stories about bishops taking weeks to traverse from parish to say mass in these areas, having no priests, having no money. And it kind of puts things into focus that we're called to respond to God in our particular times and always know that grace will be sufficient. That if it was sufficient for those bishops back in the day who had to traverse this great vast terrain that was mostly undeveloped, if we find ourselves in maybe an antagonistic culture, or maybe people are not as excited about the faith as they once were, well, so be it. We'll get on with our job and move forward because it's been pretty difficult in the past. Just also this idea of trying to unify a vast territorial diocese. It's something that if you go around the diocese long enough, you kind of, sometimes you're like, we're connected. Pensacola folks are connected to people in Madison because it seems like we never see each other or anything like that. But there is something so beautiful about the spiritual bond of a diocese, that our unity under a bishop and our shared, our priests that go from parish to parish to parish, and sometimes are religious and stuff like that, that we're all part of one cohesive spiritual body, that drives home our cohesive spiritual body that transcends all national borders and goes across the whole world. And, there's sometimes I think a lot of us wish, oh man, wouldn't it be great if we were just all nicely spaced together in one nice little circle where we could drive, half hour here, half hour there, be there, and it would be. But it's also beautiful to be something so vast that Christ unites this big territory, these 18 counties. And that's always been something on the mind of our priests and bishops, is how do we unite us together? There's only one avenue, and that's through Christ himself. I was also probably, like you were, struck by Archbishop's vocation story and these three questions that he said everybody has to ask themselves in a time of discernment. One, what do my friends think about my path? So just the importance of surrounding yourself with actual people, that this is not just something we can do on our own. What am I good at? It's such an amazing question, and such a tough question for most of us to answer, because either out of a sense of humility or embarrassment, we're just like, oh, I don't know if I can say I'm really good at anything. But the Christian is called to acknowledge God's gifts and say, you know what? I'm good at that. I'm good at Scrabble, or I'm good at speaking, or I'm good at, comforting people or something like that. Whatever it is you're good at, acknowledge that and see what God has in store for you. And then this amazing question, what do I want to do? That we are part of a faith and a spiritual journey with Christ, that he actually asks us that same question. What do you want to do? And he doesn't just dictate in a secret message from the heavens one day, like, you will do this, and there is nothing else that is possible for you. There's a great plethora of options for us to embark upon, and the Lord accompanies us in whatever we kind of choose within boundaries. Of course, not being, what do you want to do? I want to be, a terrible human being that sins every day. Maybe not that, but any kind of pathway or profession directed towards the good of others, the good of ourselves, is something that the Lord can work with. So I love these questions to ask yourself in the midst of discernment. Great stuff from Archbishop Rodi, who clearly, as a gifted man, like our bishop, could have done a number of things with their lives. And done well at them, and they chose to serve the Lord and put their talents and time and their whole lives at His service. So we thank them for their inspiration. And we thank this shared brotherhood, and again, between our Archdiocese of Mobile and Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. Well, cool. It's been great to be with you guys. What a start to 2023. I'm sure the Lord has amazing things in store for you, and He's already revealing them to you. We will see you in a couple of weeks' time to acknowledge the work of other amazing people in our diocese through the Open Door Women's Clinic Apostolate in Tallahassee. So this is a women's clinic service that's been active for years in the fight for pro-life work in our diocese. We're going to hear from two amazing women, Kathleen and Jean, who will talk about their work with women and the dedication they've had over the years and the fruit they've seen from this. So we'll see you then.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Gaudium et Spes podcast. If you would like to know more about our podcast, please visit gaudiumetspes.net or go to ptdiocese.org and click the button that says podcast. If you listen to the audio version from an app such as iTunes, Stitcher, or Spotify, be sure and rate, review, and comment. If you watched us on YouTube, make sure you like and subscribe or leave us a comment there as well. Thank you for joining us.